Hello, it's Ryan Ho back with another video. Today I want to talk about how upgrading my CPU to the 7700X actually doubled my gaming performance. I'm going to let you guys know and show you guys some gaming benchmarks of this CPU, and then I'm going to talk about how kind of to overclock this, the performance you can get from overclocking it. And then I also want to talk about the temperatures as well of this device, because it's kind of well known to be a very hot CPU that kind of goes up to 95 degrees Celsius. But we'll talk about the scenarios in which this gets hot and scenarios where it doesn't really get that hot. And if you really do need a big beefy cooler, right? Because I'm using a water cooler right here, the Corsair. But I don't think everyone needs to have the best cooler to just cool it. I also want to talk about kind of production benchmarks, so video editing. So I have some kind of benchmarks to show you guys for that as well. And then I'm going to talk about the build that I used to kind of test all of this. So stay tuned, and as always, please like and subscribe down below. Helps my videos out. And yeah, let's kind of dive into the details. And yeah, so let's talk about what I used to test this. So obviously I'm using the latest AMD 7700X, and then we're using the new motherboard, so the X670E plus Wi-Fi motherboard by Tough Gaming. So it's kind of a ASUS product. It's a $330 motherboard. I personally think this motherboard was really good. I bought it because it had really good audio on it, but anyways, it's a really good motherboard. So the RAM I got is actually the G-Skill Flare X5 DDR5. Now I actually got this for free from a Micro Center deal. Basically, you bought the CPU and you got a free RAM, which was an insane deal. That's kind of why I bought it to begin with. But it's DDR5, 5600, 16 gigabyte times 2, and CL36. So it's decent RAM. It's not the fastest and most optimal, but it's a really good actually stick of RAM, especially when you get it for free. Our cooling is actually the Corsair iQ H100i Elite Capital X, the 240 AIO. So basically it's a water cooler, and it's not the biggest one you can get in a case. It's actually, the second biggest one you can get in a case, but it honestly cools it more than adequate for my needs. We'll talk about how that affects kind of our performance in the kind of overclocking section, right? So now you know what I'm starting with. My graphics card is actually a GTX RTX 2080. It's not the newest and biggest thing. It's not the RTX 4090 that people are all talking about right now, but it's a very fast graphics card, and it's good enough for basically most games nowadays. All right, so let's talk about the benchmarks, right? So right here we have our CPU benchmarks in gaming, right? So in Valorant, you can see that you hit 535 frames. This is the game that actually doubled my performance. When I had an 8700K, which is my previous CPU, I was hitting about 240 to 360 at all times, and when I upgraded this, I was able to hit 360 consistently. And that's important because I actually upgraded my monitor to a 240 to 360 hertz monitor. I couldn't hit 360 consistently, and that's why I kind of upgraded my CPU to begin with. So that in that kind of game, it was able to really double the performance. Now, when you're playing at 1080p, the CPU makes a big difference when you're playing at 1080p and kind of lower settings. When you're playing more graphically intensive games, then it's kind of more dependent on your graphics card, right? In those type of games and at higher resolutions, I recommend people to just upgrade or buy a better graphics card than a CPU. But for me, I'm trying to play competitive games at 1080p that kind of push a lot of frames for your fast monitors. Then a good CPU makes a difference in that scenario, right? So I tested Overwatch 2, the new game now. And at high, we're getting 355 average and 273 in the minimum FPS. And then the FPS max is just a little higher at 362. And this is important because I can basically hit 362 for Overwatch on high, which is really nice to know. And if I really want to hit it consistently, I could drop a few settings lower and kind of hit that for sure. And yeah, it's not bad. Now, when you turn it up to Ultra and Overwatch 2, it goes down to 273, which is still really good. If you have 240 hertz monitor, you're still clearing the goal, right? Now moving to Cyberpunk Ultra. So Cyberpunk is a game that's much more graphically intensive. In my opinion, you just really need a good graphics card. But I wanted to show, a different type of game, not just FPS shooters that are very CPU kind of dependent. So in Cyberpunk, I'm using my RTX 2080. I was able to get 76 frames on average. And then when you're playing it on max ray tracing in Ultra, I was able to get 59, which kind of clears that, like, it's basically 60 FPS, around that benchmark of like playable game frame rate, in my opinion. Like, I don't really want to play a game like less than 60. Like between 30 and 60 is like okay, but like 60 is definitely my personal like minimum I like to play a game at. So it kind of crosses that threshold, but these games are definitely very hard to run. And the good thing about a CPU is, like, when there's a lot of things and elements happening at the same time, a good CPU kind of pushes through all of that, right? Now let's talk about the rendering benchmarks, right? So we have Davinci Resolve, and I'm rendering a 14.5-minute clip. And there's different benchmarks here, but basically there's what I call native or the CPU rendering. And you can see that when you're rendering at the H.264, which is kind of the older codec, it basically is slow, but when you're kind of rendering at the H.265, it's actually a lot faster at 256 seconds. And then we have NVENC, which is basically your GPU. So your GPU has a built-in ASIC that basically allows you to accelerate the rendering process. So you could just render with your graphics card and not have a great CPU, which is what I used to do. But now I ran this kind of test to see how fast my CPU would kind of run compared to my graphics card. And you can actually see that when you're running H.265, which is the more modern and newer codec to run, which is better, it actually runs faster than my graphics card, which is really good. So like the CPU now is as good as my graphics card, but the main difference is that the CPU actually looks better. The CPU rendering actually looks better visually when I was looking at it as well. So that's also something to consider. So for me, it's kind of a no-brainer what, I'm going to be running my videos in H.265 nowadays using my CPU to get the optimal quality and speed. So yeah. The next thing I'll talk about is Cinebench. So Cinebench R23, which is the benchmark to see kind of like, how your CPU compares with other CPUs. So I ran it in 3 different modes, right? So we had default performance where we got 19,400, and then you can see single core in red, which is 1955, right? Now the curve optimizer is literally, you download a program called Ryzen Master, and it basically undervolts your CPU, which means it reduces the voltage to the CPU, which actually reduces the temperatures that your CPU operates at, and it allows you to actually boost your CPU to higher clock speed and get a higher score, basically. So you can see that we're able to hit a higher score. And then the last one is me manually overclocking this. So my manual overclock actually got to 5.55 gigahertz, which is 150 gigahertz more than the maximum advertised on the box. So the box advertisement is basically 4.5 gigahertz is the base, 5.4 is the max. And this manual overclock I'm able to hit 5.55, which is really good with 1.26 volts. And I tested this to be consistent, right? So I used Cinebench R23. I ran it for 10 minutes to make sure that it was stable and to check the temperatures, right? Here we can kind of see the temperatures and the max clock speed with the CPU scores, right? Side by side. And you can see that the main problem at default mode is you're really hitting the 95 degrees temperature, and that is actually thermal throttling your CPU, so it isn't able to kind of boost higher. So your max clock speed is only 5.185, which is basically not even the maximum advertised boost clock of the CPU. Also, one more thing to keep in mind is that the maximum advertised 5.4 is actually on one core, but I'm hitting these numbers on every single core, right? So that's also a difference. With Curve Optimizer, you're actually able to lower the temperatures to 84. So if you use Curve Optimizer, it actually allows you to not have as great of a CPU cooler and still be able to run the CPU really well, right? It gives you kind of more headroom. And you can see that now we're actually boosting to the maximum advertised 5.4 gigahertz, which is really good. And you're performing at lower temperatures and you're getting more performance out of it, right? So it's all free. Like you just kind of do a setting in your computer and you get that, right? Now, the manual overclock is for the people who want to get even more out of their CPU. And with the manual overclock, I was able to like hit 5.55 and the temperature is at 92 degrees. Now that's running very close to like the 95 cap, but I pushed this as much as I could and it was stable for 10 minutes on Cinebench. So yeah, it was pretty good. So if we do kind of a percent increase, basically, the curve optimizer gives you a 4.5% increase from the base. And then using the manual overclock, you actually get 7.5% more performance out of your CPU than what you have in default settings. So these things are kind of worth, tweaking if you want to maximize your performance. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is just if you're playing games, honestly, like it doesn't matter if you're playing Valorant, Overwatch, the CPU temperature really doesn't get that hot. The hottest I ever got was when I played Valorant on high at like 58 degrees. And really, that was the hottest the CPU ever got. So if you're just playing games, you don't really need that big of a cooler. The only time it gets hot is when you're doing like rendering benchmarks, really. It doesn't really get that hot when I'm rendering a video. Just keep in mind, like these temperatures are like when people are stress testing the CPU, like running it maximum. Like the reality is your day-to-day use, you're not running this thing to maximum like all the time. It's just not like that, right? So in my opinion, if you know you're not doing that type of stuff, and you're just gaming, your CPU cooler could be just an okay one, honestly. Anyways, I hope you guys found this kind of data to be helpful. The game benchmarks, the CPU rendering speed, and the overclocking. Let me know if you guys have any questions down below. I think I'll probably do another video kind of showing my CPU, my computer build and all the things that I did with it, and then maybe talking about kind of the motherboard a little bit, and then maybe I'll do one about this cooler as well. So let me know if you guys want to see that content. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.